So I had a gambling addiction for almost 10 years of my life. I have not actually gambled since June of 2012. So 14 years now, which is a hell of an accomplishment. But looking back at that time when I was in active addiction and thinking about the fact that I was also undiagnosed autistic ADHD, I had no idea. But I also was so out of control and so reckless and so impulsive that a lot of the time I was misdiagnosed, bipolar too, put on a laundry list of medications for antipsychotic meds, which had disastrous effect and impact. And looking back at it, I understand why the psychiatrist thought the way that he thought. There was no inclination that autism or ADHD were in play. It was just he was seeing impulsivity, recklessness, dangerous behaviors. And he was seeing like drastic mood changes and a lot of struggles with regulation. So I don't fault him for that. And I know a lot of people who have been misdiagnosed similarly and put on a cocktail of meds that didn't work or made things worse or exacerbated symptoms and struggles. And it sucks, to think that that is such a common experience. And looking back at the gambling addiction days, I was your stereotypical gambling addict. Like, it started small. I remember getting like a rush or a dopamine hit when I was playing poker with friends in high school. And we would be playing for $20 if we had it. We were broke high school kids. And I would always want to play for higher stakes. And I would always want to play again if we finished for the night. I'd be like, let's play another game, or let's double the buy-in, or whatever the case may be. Never thought much of that at the time. And then that led to taking a few trips through northern New York, where I grew up, to one of the casinos that were 18 years old to gamble. And that started to become more and more frequent, losing money constantly, having to borrow it, having to steal it, or working really hard to make money to pay gambling debts and to feed the habit. And then when I went away to college, I wasn't a gambling addict at that time. I think there was concern, but I was not concerned. But looking at it through the lens I do now, I'm like, yeah, there were a lot of red flags. There were a lot of signs here. But I didn't, I was an 18, 19-year-old kid in college. I didn't think much of it. We did a lot of the stereotypical college things, drinking a lot, smoking a lot of weed, gambling, etc. So none of this stuff ever felt really that unusual. Unfortunately, it felt quite typical given proximity to so much of it. And trigger warning for this, by the way, but my freshman year of college, one of my suite mates died by suicide in my fall semester. He was a good friend of mine from my hometown, and we had gone to college together. And it was so shocking and such a hard experience to make sense of, because the signs, I didn't see them. I blame myself. He was just really struggling with a lot of his own personal demons, so to speak. And he had just come out of the closet as a gay man, and he had received a lot of discrimination. And I just didn't see the signs that he was going to do that. And I blamed myself for a long time. And I think a lot of people would numb themselves at this point with alcohol, with some sort of substance. And instead, for me, gambling became that substance. I went to college in Plattsburgh, New York, which is about 30 minutes south of Montreal. And unfortunately had two casinos where you could be 18 years old to gamble, in Montreal and then Akwesasne on a reservation in northern New York. And I spent a lot of time in those places. And what started as a $50 to $100 a habit that I would get from like spending money from my parents for the month, for the semester, turned into a full-fledged addiction very quickly. And, I think autistic and ADHD brains and nervous systems, gambling can really be something that can be really concerning. And you see that with like a lot of online gaming and even technology addiction and technology usage. And what would happen to my brain is that it would get flooded with dopamine in the casino because you've got sensory overwhelm in there, and it's done very purposefully and psychologically. The noise of the machines going off, the lighting, the placement of where things are. There's a lot of energy in those rooms. The temperature was always like ice cold, surrounded by alcohol, surrounded by the ability to just disappear into it. And that's where I spent a lot of my life from freshman year in 2004 to senior year in 2008. And I have no idea how I graduated college. I never went to class. I am academically gifted, so there were a lot of times where I would take the tests or do the papers and do really well, but then I'd lose letter grades because I didn't make the attendance policies. I worked the entire time I was in college at a restaurant. Started off at Applebee's and then ended up eventually at a fine dining restaurant as a bartender. And those jobs are not great if you have a gambling addiction because you have cash all the time. And that just meant that I had more money to go to the casino with or play in underground poker rooms with that I would find throughout northern New York, or I would sports bet. And I would lose constantly. You're always like robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, trying to figure out ways to get advances on paychecks or borrowing money from friends that you promise you'll pay back and that this is the last time you'll do this. And the problem just intensifies and gets worse and worse and worse as you lose more and more and more control. And as that continued to happen, consequences became more disastrous and intensified. My mental health was deteriorating rapidly, experiencing unbelievable amounts of depression, overwhelm, grief. The impulsivity was outrageous. I would flip a coin sometimes to decide if I should go to the casino. I knew the answer was always going to be yes, so I don't know why I even did that. It was like these rules that I set out for myself, probably as an autistic person, like really enjoying like the structure and the rules that I would create and follow. And I would flip a coin and I'd say, if it's heads, I'm going to the casino tonight. And I did that during major blizzards and snowstorms in northern New York, driving unbelievably recklessly, thanks ADHD and addiction, through the streets of northern New York in snowstorms, going like 70, 80 miles an hour through back roads and not giving a fuck if I got pulled over or if I was going to endanger myself. And there would be this like building anticipation for gambling. And I think that's why when we talk about process addictions, it's the process, the buildup that can be the high. And I would notice like I was a different person in that energy and headspace where nothing else mattered. And you were so focused on what was ahead of you, on how to make it happen, that it was a rush and it felt exhilarating. And I'd be driving through the streets in the middle of the night to get to the casino. I'd lie to my girlfriend and say I was like, oh yeah, I'm not interested in hanging out tonight. I'm just going to go to bed, or lie to friends and family members and get to the casino. And once you place that first bet, win or lose, the high like dissipated immediately. And all of a sudden you were like, how did I end up back here? It was almost like in this trance mode. And I would lose so often. The casinos allow you to overdraw your bank account and your debit card. They'll allow you to take thousands of dollars out, regardless of whether you have it. And there's such a high prevalency of suicidality and completed suicide for gambling addicts. And a lot of it is because of the massive financial loss and psychological impact that it has. So desperation kicks in when you lose thousand upon thousand upon thousands of dollars, and it builds up, and you start to think, how am I ever going to get this back? How am I ever going to get out from under this hole? And at first it's like lying to your family members. I'd tell my family like, oh, a group of us from our dorms are going to go, I think I said like skydiving at one point, and I need X amount of money. And at that time, my parents didn't really have a reason to question what I was telling them. And as those requests increased, and as my the amount that I came home during breaks decreased, and the amount that I worked increased, they started to become suspicious and finally found out that I was, really struggling. And I just refused to come home at those points in time. I would just work double shifts at the restaurants. I would try constantly to be making as much money as possible. I had a dog at the time. It was a basset hound named Herman. And my only rule for myself was I always needed to have gas in my car and food for him. And that was it. Otherwise, I didn't have food in my fridge. I didn't eat often. I did a lot of regrettable things that I still carry a lot of shame around about to get money. And it just consumed me to the point where like friends were starting to become very concerned, and I would be taken into bookies, like sports betting bookies, cars, and threatened because I had owed them massive amounts of money, and when I would just duck them to try to avoid the consequences. I would sometimes win money because that's a part of gambling, right? Is like you can't constantly be losing. It would be hard to hook you in if that was the case. And there were times where I won a lot of money, an exorbitant amount of money. I ended up sneaking out of a hotel room in a family trip to Ireland late at night, taking a taxi to a small casino about 25, 30 minutes away from the city of Galway. Never thought about like, what if I lose my money? How will I get back to the hotel? That wasn't even a thought. And turned 100 euros into 10,000 euros and left. And that casino owner took the money out of a safe, shoved it in my chest, told me to get the fuck out of there. He did not have to give me that money. Bad things could have happened there. And that was like, you have these moments in gambling when you're like, see, I figured it out. Like, I'll never gamble again. I'll pay off all my debts. I will stay away from the casinos. I finally did it. And I realized while in the midst of my addiction that there was never enough money. It was never even about the money. It was the feeling, the rush, the excitement, the consumption that it had over you. It was like this, you just could not break out of it. And of course, I go back to the States with all of that money. I hid it from my parents. I drive back up to school, and I immediately drive to Montreal to go to the casino. And I lost all of that money in less than an hour. And when that happens over and over and over again, there's this gut punch feeling, this absolute hell of hitting rock bottom again. When you lose the money that was going to right the ship, that was going to change your life, that was going to help you never have to feel this way again, in a matter of minutes, because impulsivity and hyperfixation takes over in those moments when you're gambling, where you start making irrational decisions. Like, I'm going to throw $5,000 on black on roulette without even like a second thought, and then it hits red and you lose that 5,000, and then you try to get it back. You're always trying to get it back. You are always trying to figure out a way to get that first loss back and make all of the money back. You create all these mental concessions and do all of these mental gymnastics. Once I do this thing, I'll pay back the bookies. I'll pay back my friends. I'll pay back my family. I will not have to work every day that I'm here. I can focus on school again. And it's never true. And you spend all of your waking life and day and night thinking about the next bet. And that's what people don't understand, is it is consuming your day. And that's what we talk a lot about in addiction spaces, is how often are you having these thoughts and these actions, and how much of your day is being consumed by thinking about how to gamble, how to get money, how to go back and do it again. And it's basically a 24/7 nonstop process. And as an autistic person who has a lot of rumination and a lot of like cognitive looping, that became torturous. And what would end up happening is that you then start to figure out ways to creatively obtain the money that you need to go feed the addiction. And I think the most hard and challenging thing about being in active addiction is the acknowledgement that you are in active addiction. I knew I was destroying myself. People would say, "You're destroying yourself. Can't you just stop? Can't you just please just do anything you can to step away from this?" And you knew that. It's not lost on you in those moments, but you can't stop. And I think that is the worst part of addiction, is that acknowledgement of, I know how destructive and harmful this is, and I cannot stop it from happening. And that was so fucking painful to be in that headspace. And when you're in that headspace, some dark thoughts go through your mind. I mean, definitely contemplated suicide constantly because the debts just pile up and you don't see a way out. I stole from people. I'm not proud of that. It was bad. It was really, really bad. I'm just thinking back about that. And you start to think very irrationally on how I can solve my problems quickly. How can I get out of this debt quickly? I thought about robbing convenience stores or robbing banks. You become so desperate because you have dug such a hole for yourself financially that it feels like you are constantly trying to dig out from under it, and it just keeps getting deeper no matter what you do. And I tried so many drastic things, as so many of you probably have who have been in addiction, of abstinence did not work for me. That was just telling my brain that I could never do something again. No thanks. Thank you, ADHD and PDA. I went to 12-step meetings, which I always despised because I'm not religious. And I just thought it was always basically trauma dumping and war stories. And that was fine, but I didn't see that as a solution. I saw the people who had a lot of abstinence under their belts really struggling and white knuckling through it a lot of the time. So they weren't really living their lives. A lot of people refer to that as being dry drunk if you're in Alcoholics Anonymous. I tried individual therapy. I tried group therapy. I went to SAIOP, or Substance Abuse Intensive Outpatient. But it was always about all substance related or alcohol related, and it just didn't feel the same for me, since with gambling, it's all psychological. There is no substance. So that was really challenging. And I would have periods of sobriety and abstinence, and you could start to see your life righting the ship and fixing itself and things starting to fall in place. And then you would do it again and you would relapse. And each relapse was worse than the last. And it created so much guilt and shame because you're admitting to yourself, I don't have control over this. I am destroying myself and the people who love me, who are around me. Hard to keep employment at that point in time. Hard to stay in relationship with people. You push everybody away who's close to you because you don't want them to know what's going on, even though they see it clear as day. You become really distant and reclusive. You surround yourself with people who are in similar situations. That's why the old adverb of people, places, and things in Gamblers Anonymous and 12-step meetings are, that is one thing that I agree with. It's hard to get out of this hellhole with constantly surrounding yourself with people who are encouraging you or not helping you make healthy choices. I remember when I was in college, I was a criminal justice major. I started as a psychology major. My goal was to be a therapist. And once my friend died, I just wove the white flag of I got to do something that feels easier. A lot of my friends at the time were criminal justice majors, so I just decided that was the route I was going to go. I have zero interest in being a part of law enforcement because of the law enforcement culture. But that was what I decided because it was just path of least resistance. And I remember we were taking a school trip in one of my advanced classes to the Dannemora Maximum Security Prison in Dannemora, New York. It's it's a rough place for people who have committed some really serious crimes. And we were in this group that was like a cutting edge group where the inmates were not confined or restrained in any way when in group spaces or in the public. And everyone was sharing their own experiences about how they got there and holding each other accountable. It was actually really cool. And I fell asleep because I had been up all night the night before playing poker at some poker room. And my head was on my chest like this. And the guy next to me kind of tapped me on the shoulder and he was like, "You don't want to fall asleep in here." I was like, oh, you have these wake up calls constantly and these aha, like epiphany moments, but you still can't stop. And you know that things are not heading in the right direction for sure. I graduated college in 2008. No idea how. I was engaged at the time to someone who I went to college with. Our relationship was horrible, mainly because I was an active gambling addict, undiagnosed autistic ADHD, all the things. And when that relationship ended, I decided I should uproot my life in upstate New York and just impulsively decided I should move to Asheville, North Carolina. And I was still gambling at the time intensely. I was selling cars because I had impulsively quit a job working with traumatic brain injuries in a field that I actually liked. Ended up selling cars and being really good at it, which meant a lot of money in my pocket very often. And that's when gambling went from like thousands of dollars to like tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands even at times when I had won some money and doubled down on it. And I remember taking all of that cash out. I had about $50,000 in cash and I gave it to my dad. And I said, "Until I move to Asheville in a month, I want you to hide this from me because if I have access to it, I'm going to gamble it away." And he was like, "Okay, I can do that." I, of course, found his very easy hiding spot that he chose. And I was just taking money out of it on a daily basis, going to this poker room that I had found in this old abandoned warehouse in Newburgh, New York. And by the time I got to moving to Asheville, instead of $40,000, I now had 20. Instead of like a nest egg to live on for a year or two while I got acclimated, the resources were dwindling. And when I made the 12-hour drive down, I decided instead of taking one route, I should take the route that goes by the casino that was in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And you drive right past it. There's no like avoiding it when you take that route on 81. And of course, I stopped and I spent 18 hours there. And my dog was in my car and I have to keep going outside, letting him out, making sure he's okay. And I lost almost every single dollar that I had. I had to sleep in a McDonald's parking lot that night with my dog, with the bright lights blaring into our car, no blankets, no pillows. I couldn't even get gas because I had maxed my debit card out for the night. So we were kind of stuck. And by the time I got to Asheville, it's like tail between my legs, basically. I had like $4,000 left, which was enough to pay rent and basically get groceries and buy some furniture. And at that point in time, that was like the millionth time that I had let myself do this to myself. And as that happens, what happens is I think for some of us who have decided very early on, like, I know I'm in active addiction and I need to change this. And you just keep trying and you just keep trying and you keep dipping down further and further and hitting a new low and a new rock bottom. And you're still desperately trying to get out of it because you know that this is not going to end well. You're not going to live much longer if you continue down this path. I had conversations with myself about how I would never live to see 25. And you just keep trying desperately, clawing on to any amount of resilience and way to get yourself out of this until something sticks. And a lot of people don't make it, unfortunately. I don't know what the turning point was for me. People ask me that all the time. I just know that the last time I gambled was June of 2012, and Asheville is very close to Cherokee, North Carolina, and there's a casino there. It's about an hour and a half away, and they had just announced that they had put in live dealers for table games instead of like virtual games, which I never enjoyed. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go. It wasn't even a thought. I didn't even have like any resistance to it. But I only had like $300 to my name at the time. I lost that money in about 10 minutes. And you're just sitting in your car, just that realization hits you like a ton of bricks. And you're like, I did it again. Like, I cannot believe I allowed myself to do this again to myself. And now I can't pay my bills, or now I can't get out of this. And I just remember on that very long drive home in the darkness of the mountains of North Carolina that I just told myself, I can never do this again. And that was the aha moment that I needed after a lot of aha moments. Like, it was not the first time. And it stuck for some reason, and I am unbelievably grateful for that. And it was really hard to work out from under all of the debt and all of the struggle, the fact that I destroyed my credit, taking out credit cards and loans and not paying them back. You never realize how quickly you can destroy your credit, but how long it takes to rebuild it. It took almost 7 to 8 years to get back to a place where I now have an 800 credit score. And it took a lot of ownership and accountability, as well as allowing yourself to truly embrace the fact that you need help. It meant that I had to do a lot of soul searching in terms of submitting myself and just truly allowing myself to experience the suck, so to speak. And I got a job working at a nonprofit with the unhoused population here in Western North Carolina as a caseworker. I got really lucky to get that job because my job history was super spotty and mostly filled with restaurant jobs. I definitely embellished my resume many times out of desperation, and I get why people do it. I've been there because I needed work. And I got this job around the unhoused population, working towards permanent supportive housing. And I think that was really what I needed, was to be around people who are just so down on their luck and under-resourced and do not have the privilege and just have been forgotten about by society, unfortunately. And it was just amazing what that job did for me in terms of putting things in perspective. A lot of those people, not all, but a lot, were people who either were dealing with addiction or mental health issues that just intensified, and resources were not there. And they also just did not have the support systems in place, and they ended up on the streets. And it was just such a good perspective check for me. And it led me to going to get my master's in clinical mental health counseling, and eventually opening up a private practice, which is now a group practice, and a lot of other things along the way. But one thing that I've always wanted to talk about, and always do talk about, is just the struggle that people experience and trying to help normalize it and humanize it, because I know so many of you are in similar spots or have been, and you are not alone. And I know that it makes you think that you are, and that it really makes you question your sense of self and your self-esteem and the guilt and the shame and the hopelessness. I remember before I moved to North Carolina, standing on a soccer field while I was playing, thinking like, I don't ever foresee myself getting out of this. I have put myself in such a bad position that is so out of control that I have no way out. And there was no hope. And I think that being able to come down here and get away from people, places, and things, and just try one last ditch effort to figure it out. And that does not mean that you do not have cravings and urges, even in sobriety, because you do. Life is stressful, and we are struggling as humans, all in our own way. And there have been a handful of times where I have definitely been tempted, because you convince yourself one of the neural pathways in your brain is like, this would be the way out of this. This would be a way to relieve a lot of this overwhelm. This would help you feel alive again, whatever you tell yourself. I remember being in New Orleans with some friends and my wife, and we were going to a Saints game, and I was meeting them, but I was walking by myself. I was about 30 minutes behind them. I kind of got to a crossroads where there was a sign in front of me that said, like, go to the right, to the Superdome to see where the Saints play or go to the left where the casino was. And I stood there for 20 minutes and I was like, I could go left and nobody would ever know. And I had to like really work on some coping skills to regulate and walk the other direction, acknowledging how much I would lose if I ended up doing that. And then I remember driving back from Tennessee one time through the mountains of North Carolina, and I intentionally took the route that brought me right back past the casino in Cherokee. And I sat outside in my car for a good 20 minutes, and I thought, I have a small business now. I could use my business debit card. Nobody would ever know. My wife wouldn't have to find out. All of those things go through your head, and you start to try to convince yourself that this is a good decision. This is a good idea. And I knew that I needed to get through the next 15 minutes of distraction to be able to get through that trigger and that urge in that moment. Because the urges are like waves and they come in really intensely, but they do dissipate. So I ended up calling a friend who I knew would pick up the phone. And I said, hey, I don't really have anything to talk about right now, but I need to talk for 15 minutes. Gave him an idea of what was up. Kept driving. Once I got through that distance, I was like, all right, man, thank you. I'm good. And those are the things you learn along the way of how to navigate living in a world that is overwhelming a lot of the time and not reaching for the Band-Aid short-term fix or solution that might bring maybe some joy, excitement, dopamine, adrenaline, etc. for a very brief window of time. It is not a long-term solution. It just creates more havoc and more problem. And another thing that's been helpful is being able to acknowledge that I would lose so much if I ever went back to that life. My wife, our home, my small businesses, like everything I've worked for would be undone in an instant, in the blink of an eye. And that's stuff that I keep in mind, and I'm grateful to be able to anchor into that as well. And, learning that I was autistic ADHD later in life gave me a lens through which I've now view the world, because I remember being in college and high school and junior high and just feeling so lonely and so different and so disconnected that I reached for things like alcohol and marijuana and gambling and things that made me just feel more a part of the world and more connected to people, even instantaneously, even if they were not good people to be connected to, just to feel less alone. And how often I reached for things because of how dysregulated my nervous system can be, or how overwhelmed I can be from a sensory perspective, or how I struggle socially and feel awkward and lonely very often. And I think when those things are happening, it makes so much sense why so many of us reach for things that are not healthy to help us get through, to help us try to cope, to help us make those feelings feel less painful and tolerable. But it never, ever is a long-term solution. And that is the reality of like having to figure out ways to get through those moments. And a lot of us experience them fairly often. Add in bullying, add in discrimination, add in harassment, add in burnout, like add in stress, like depression, OCD, whichever gets thrown in the mix, maybe all of it. And it makes a lot of sense why we try really hard to distance ourselves from those feelings. And a lot of times I talk about how you have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable and sit with discomfort and be okay with it and acknowledge that it's okay to feel those feelings. We don't have to run from them. We don't have to like repress them or dissociate from them or numb them. That they are there for a reason. And for a lot of us, they're very intense. But that does not mean it has to lead to something that is going to be destructive and potentially catastrophic. So if you followed along through this whole video, I hope that you find some semblance of hope, that you are worth living for, that you do deserve happiness, that you do deserve to recover if you find yourself in active addiction or have been, that the guilt and shame will dissipate. You have to do the work. And it's important to surround yourself with community and people who care and people who get it. Go to therapy if you can. Go to support groups if that's what you need. and learn more about yourself. I've been a lifelong learner, always wondering why I've felt the way that I feel. And that means doing a lot of introspection and deep dives and therapy. And a lot of it has been really painful and uncomfortable. And I've had countless therapists in my life, some of whom I ghosted, never went back to, was too overwhelmed by the experience, just was too shameful about what might have come up. And you have to learn to live with the good and the bad and both sides of the coin. And you have to just give yourself permission to be a human being. You may have made mistakes. You may have things that you've done that you feel an enormous amount of shame about. And I promise you that it can get better and that you are not alone. And if you've learned later in life that you're autistic or ADHD or ADHD and you're starting to see the world through that lens, it makes a lot of sense why things have felt the way that they felt and have been as hard as they are, and can ultimately lead to making decisions that are not healthy for you. But I get it. And I know that that feels like that may never end either. But I promise you that if you start to do some distancing from reaching for that glass of alcohol or that joint or that whatever is your, whatever is your vice, and you can put distance in between it and start to just regulate your nervous system and work on creating safety and security for yourself and understanding, and just putting distance in between needing to reach for something when uncomfortable feelings come up or uncomfortable experiences come up, acknowledging that there is a lot of suffering in life and there's a lot of joy. There are a lot of beautiful moments. There are a lot of things to be grateful for and celebrate. And I'm going to quote one of my favorite shows, Rings of Power. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. Some of you might be Lord of the Rings fans and saying, like, I hate that show. It doesn't follow the lore. But Galadriel says, sometimes to find the light, you need to touch the darkness. And I will leave you with that. Make sure you're following me on Substack, YouTube, Instagram, or any of my podcasts. And just know that you are not alone.